Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Rich Billotto, and welcome to another episode, number 47, of The Real Thomas Jefferson. The aim of this show, The Real Thomas Jefferson, is to get real about Thomas Jefferson, to revise and revisit the revisionists in the business of deconstructing Jefferson's prose, including his letters, addresses, memos, etc. Nearly all Jeffersonian biographers today take it upon themselves to write of Jefferson's two-facedness. They claim that what Jefferson says most often cannot be understood literally. His prose must be deconstructed, and so intuitiveness and knack are needed in preference to logical acumen. It is commonplace to call the man a hypocrite and even a contradiction. Maybe we'll see if there's any contradictory elements to his writings today. This show then
Never.
aims to dispel that myth. Jefferson, we believe, can be known, and logic, not intuition or discretionary deconstruction is the method by which we're going to understand Jefferson's writings. The expert that we have here today is Dr. Mark Andrew Holowchak. He is a professor of philosophy and history. He taught at the universities of Pittsburgh, Michigan, and Rutgers University at Camden. He's authored over 70 books, 28 of them on Thomas Jefferson, and he has over 400 published essays, formal and informal, and over 250 of those are in regards to Thomas Jefferson. He also writes on Ukraine, and you can see some of his videos on Ukraine on his Facebook page. But today, at the bidding of one of our viewers, we discussed Jefferson's view of France at the start of the French Revolution. The question was this: with France having aided the colonists so substantially during the United States' revolution, America's revolution, might not Jefferson's encouragement of the French Revolution be considered a betrayal to France? We aim to answer that question by focusing on one of the most singular dinners in the history of the world, a dinner at Jefferson's Parisian residence, August 26, 1789. Before I started studying Jefferson, I wasn't even aware of this dinner, but from some of my research, most of it through Dr. Holowchak, I found this to become one of the most pivotal dinners. And
Yeah, it's interesting. I've referred to this and written about this on several occasions without sitting back and thinking just how singular this dinner was. I think it might have claim to being one of the most important in the history of the world because it had an impact, such an influence on global affairs. And we'll get into that. Yeah, and glad you're back with us here after your vacation back
I'm glad
in Michigan.
it was
And I started here.
Oh, sure. So one of the things we would like to know is just what was the precipitating cause of this dinner?
Well, Jefferson gets a letter by a French Marquis, friend of his, and Lafayette. Lafayette writes the following letter to him. He says to Thomas Jefferson, August 25, 1789, I'm going to read the letter. I beg
Please.
for liberty's sake, you will break every engagement to give us a dinner tomorrow, Wednesday. We shall be some members of the National Assembly, 8 of us, whom I want to coalize, being the only means to prevent a total dissolution and a civil war. The difficulty between them is the king's veto. We want it absolute, others will have no veto, and the only way to unite them is to find some means for a suspensive veto so strong as so complicated as to give the king a due influence. If they don't agree in a few days, we shall have no great majority in favor of any plan, and it must end in a war because the discontented party will unite either with aristocratic or factious people. These gentlemen wish to consult you and me. They will dine tomorrow at your house, as mine is always full. I depend on you to receive us. Perhaps they will be late, but I shall be precisely at 3 with you. And I think this dinner of an immediate and great importance. Adieu, adieu, my dear friend. So the precipitating cause of the dinner is this letter by Lafayette, which he's in a frenzy. He's perplexed. The French Revolution, in effect, has already begun, and what's going to be up for discussion is really the power of the king, the three estates. We'll talk about that later in this. Three estates: one the aristocracy, another the clergy, and the third the people, the peasantry. And the people are clearly in the majority, and how these three estates are to display their political power in France. And in effect, what is being open for discussion is a constitution for potentially a new republic, one that will presumably state explicitly the powers entitled the king and the various houses of the estates, Estat General, or the States General. So the cause for the dinner is this worried and concerned letter by Lafayette that is sent to Jefferson. And Jefferson, in effect, he says, doesn't have much choice but to have the dinner. Lafayette doesn't so much ask him. He says, "I'll be there at 3."
He imposed.
So, yeah. So what options does Jefferson really have? Right? He could, I say what options does he have because as the minister plenipotentiary to France, he's not supposed to be involved in French affairs, right? He is, as it were, constitutionally barred from intermingling. He's a minister that deals with foreign affairs, but he's not supposed to deal with France's own political affairs. If there's a political crisis going on, it's nothing that should concern him. So by having the dinner, he's putting himself in an awkward position. But what has Lafayette said? "I'll be there at 3." So in effect, go ahead.
After the dinner, Jefferson did check in with Comte de Montmorin. I guess he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs under Louis the 16th. Who was Montmorin that he encouraged Jefferson to be the master of ceremonies at this dinner?
Montmorin was not necessarily encouraging him, but Jefferson knew that the word would get out that he's hosting a dinner and he's not supposed to host a dinner. And to put it bluntly, his ass is on the line. And if you're doing something you're not supposed to do, Jefferson always plays by the book, right? Most of the other ministers and so forth, Adams is not so strict, and other political figures might not be as strict as Jefferson, but Jefferson really plays everything by the book. So he knows he's not supposed to do this. In some sense, he can't but do it because Lafayette's going to come anyway, and everybody's coming over. So one option is that he could just run away. He was supposed to be involved in certain affairs months ago, and Jefferson declined, right? But here, Lafayette doesn't leave him much option. So when when news of the affair gets out the next day, he talks to the Count Lecomte, and I did something wrong. He wants an apologize, in effect. And Montmorin says, "Don't worry about it. It's not a big problem."
Okay.
And we'll talk about why it's not really a big problem. But for Jefferson, it is because he doesn't want to violate his duties as minister.
Sure. So Lafayette brought along with him a clan, his National Assembly or members thereof, right? Could you tell us something about them?
I'll just say who they were.
Yeah.
Royalists who would be known later on as Friands, and then he had Republicans who would be known later on as Jacobins. So he had the two different factions party. The Royalists, obviously, is the name loyal to the king and so forth, and to the aristocracy. So as I said, in the Estat General, you had the clergy, you had the aristocracy. These are the royalists for the most part. And then you had the peasantry, the people, who were the overwhelming majority, but had very, very little power. We'll talk about the powers possessed by those three groups of people in a little bit.
But at this dinner, we only have representatives of the Royalists and the Republicans. There were
Yeah,
no.
and the Republicans can be said, in some sense, to be representatives of the will of the majority of people.
Okay.
Right. So we have Marquis de Blacon, who is a royalist, Jean-Joseph Mounier. He's a moderate royalist, Francois-Edouard Augustin Venkelos Hippolyte, better known or AKA Count d'Agoult. Try saying these French words all the time. My French is not what it used to be. The Republicans, we have Adrien Dupont, Joseph Barnave, Alexander Lameth, Marie-Charles de Fay, who's the Comte de la Tour Marbourg. So you have a roughly an equal number of each party, and then you have Lafayette here, who is Lafayette was a friend of Jefferson from the American Revolution. They met, and Lafayette was much younger than Jefferson.
So he was the royalist.
No, I think he's probably more of a Republican.
But he wasn't. He wouldn't fall into. He was independent.
I don't know. I think he'd probably have his inclinations are more Republican, more for the people at the time. But nonetheless, I think he sees his role in this as being sort of like Jefferson. Let's bring the contending parties together for a discussion of what we can do. In effect, they're debating a constitution for France.
Right.
The Constitution tells you what the king's powers are, what the three parts of the governing powers are, and so forth. And so they want to discuss that issue to prevent a revolution. The people are rising up, right?
Right. So those were the guests, and they spent some time there. What was discussed while they were there?
Well, yeah, they spent some time there. I assume Lafayette shows up at 3 o'clock, like he says.
Yes.
So we don't know, but we don't have any evidence that he didn't. So I assume he's going to get there, and everybody else is supposed to be there roughly at 3 o'clock as well. And so they, as customary at the time, and among the aristocracy of Europe and of America, and Jefferson might be considered the aristocracy in Virginia, you have a dinner, you eat some food, and then after that, you clear the table, take off the cloth, you bring the wine, and you start drinking and talking. Right? The table is set for bibulousness, for getting a little buzz on and talking about the stuff of the day. So Jefferson writes in his autobiography, says from 4 to 10 o'clock, so we have 6 good hours of conversation. Now, I'll read what Jefferson writes in his autobiography, and we can discuss what was discussed, what we think was discussed. He says, the cloth being removed and wine set on the table after the American manner, the Marquis introduced the objects of the conference by summarily reminding them of the state of things in the assembly, the course which the principles of the Constitution were taking, and the inevitable result unless checked by more concord among the patriots themselves. Right? And then he argues, and he writes, further on, he writes, I was a silent witness to a coolness and candor of argument unusual in the conflicts of political reasoning and chaste eloquence, disfigured by no gaudy tinsel of rhetoric or declamation. It's a lot like Trump talking, right? And truly worthy of being placed in parallel with the finest dialogues of antiquity as handed us by Xenophon, by Plato, and by Cicero. The result was an agreement that the king should have a suspensive veto on the laws and that the legislature should be composed of a single body only, and that to be chosen by the people. This concordate decided the fate of the Constitution. The patriots all rallied to the principles thus settled, carried every question agreeable to them, and reduced the aristocracy to insignificance and impotence. So I said we had 3 bodies of the governing body, the States General. What they decided is to get rid of the clergy and the aristocracy, right? Legislature says should be composed of a single body only. So we're going to have one group of people, as it were, one body of people. It doesn't go on to explain how that works, right? So the idea here, as I said before, they're literally discussing the French Revolution has begun, and there's violence, and they're literally discussing possibilities of quelling, of removing and quashing the violence. The discussion necessarily has to take into consideration the desires and wants of the aristocracy, the desires and wants of the clergy, the desires and wants of the people, right? There was an extraordinary gap between the peasantry, the overwhelming majority of people, and the landed aristocracy and the clergy, who owned just about everything, where the people own nothing. We talk about the gap between the people in America. This was something that was even much more magnified. Peasants literally had nothing. The people owned everything. People with large estates, for example, Jefferson better, they would have these vast bodies of land uncultivated. Jefferson hated to see land uncultivated because it could be used for farming, because the wealthy wanted to go on their fox hunts and do like things like that. So they needed land for their playtime. And Jefferson thought that was rather egregious. Anyways, I mean, so in effect, to answer the question, we're discussing a possible constitution, as it were, for France, right? To avoid a massive revolution. They're not going to avoid the revolution. The revolution will occur, and then in the aftermath, we get the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. That's another story. But yeah, so I mean, trying to prevent a revolution, and they don't do good. You want to come up, Jeff? Here comes Jeff.
Hey, Jeffy.
How you doing, buddy? All right, ready for the next one. Jeff, are you ready? He looked at me like, you know, when a dog does that, they're always like, what's going on? What's going on? Come on.
Can't make up his mind.
Yeah, doesn't have Thomas Jefferson's brain, but boy, he's lovely. Boy, you met him, so you know, right? You want to sit down?
He's a cute dog.
Yeah.
I've got on the floor with him.
Good boy, Jeff. All right, what's the next one?
So you've kind of hinted at it, that there was a disparity between the general population and the aristocracy. But can you go into more detail about other factors that were causative towards the French Revolution?
So in other words, Baldric, what was the cause of the French Revolution is the question. If you ever watched The Blackadder, I don't know if you ever watched that.
No.
But Private Baldric is with Captain Blackadder, and they're in a dugout pit in trenches and stuff like that. And Baldric, who's asked Captain Blackadder, he goes, you know, at one time there was a war, and another time there wasn't a war. So how do we get from the state of events where there wasn't a war to the time where there is a war? And, you know, and then, you know, what are the possibilities for there not being a war, you know, after there being a war? And Blackadder goes, so in other words, Baldric, you mean what caused the war? Yeah, that's right.
So
all right, I mean, you know.
Was that Hugh Laurie and Mr. Bean?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, then I have seen that.
Really brilliant, very, very funny sitcom. If some of the viewers watched Ronak's Blackadder, it's the typical smart guy, dumb people around dumb people thing, and it's a brilliant sitcom. It's probably my favorite sitcom of all time.
I've seen some shorts.
Very versatile, very funny guy. Anyways, so what caused the Revolutionary War? And I'm no expert on it. I can give you my 2 cents. I'll mention 3 causes. One being the American Revolution in a non-straightforward sense. The very fact that the colonists had a revolution against the mother country, England, and were successful in that, gave all sorts of hope for people everywhere who were struggling under aristocratic or abusive governments. The idea is that power in the people, power in numbers. If there should be a revolution of the people, there's nothing that the aristocracy or the people governing can really do, right? They can turn the army against, but the people are more numerous than the army. And ultimately, if the people are one and to win, the success of the American Revolution was causative, was ideologically significant in the French Revolution. In other words, without the American Revolution, there wouldn't have been a French Revolution. So it's a necessary cause, not a sufficient cause. It's not the sort of cause that by itself led to it. Um, Another cause was the great debt that France was experiencing. They were substantially, the government was substantially in debt. And when you're that much in debt, it's difficult to do anything. It's difficult to have a robust foreign policy. It's difficult to go to war and all sorts of things that a nation needs to do. And a lot of that debt was caused by French participation in, Lafayette coming in and French participation in the American Revolution and the great help that the French people. And here, the person who asked me this question about Jefferson's potential betrayal of the government of France when he's in effect inciting a revolution at his house, or at least one could argue he's doing that. I don't think he was doing that. So, there's a lot of debt. The French gave a lot. They were always at war with Britain. They were at war with Britain. And one way to get the better of Britain is to help the Americans in the Revolution, which they did. And the Americans, as we know, were successful. A third cause was social injustice, social unrest. And I said I'll get into some figures here. The States, Estates General had 3 Estates, and there was up for decision as things stood at the matter is that each party, the clergy, the nobility, and the peasants had, the way things were constitutionally, had 1 vote. And, the peasantry, obviously, that the people were always overruled, whatever their interests were, because the nobility and the clergy would always team up together, their interests being almost coincidental on every issue, both being nobility in some sense. So the people were underrepresented in some measure by this 1-1-1 system. So they considered changing the system by voting for a number of delegates, with each delegate having 1 vote. Now, the clergy numbered some 100,000 people. They own 6% of the land. They collect tithes and so forth to help them finance themselves. So they're, drawing money from people and so forth. They didn't pay any taxes. They had 303 delegates. The nobility, numbering about 300,000, had 282 delegates. If we add those together, that gives us what, 300, 282, that's 582 delegates. The peasants, of whom there were 16 million, 97% of the population, had 578 delegates. So if we just go by a strict delegative change, the peasants had 578, and then the clergy and nobility together would have 582. So by those numbers, of course, they were done intentionally to give the people some sense that by the new system, that they had almost the same number of delegates as the clergy and nobility, but they didn't. But by the new system, it seems to represent the interests of the peasants better.
Right.
And it clearly.
So the old system, they had 0 delegates.
Yeah, there were no delegates. It's just the clergy as a whole would vote, and their vote would be 1. The nobility as a whole would vote. They'd discuss and vote, and their vote would be 1. So it generally would be on contentious issues, like a 2-to-1 vote on things. Now, the peasants at least had some possibility of winning the day on certain issues if they could convince some of the clergy, the delegates of the clergy and nobility, to side with them. That typically didn't happen. So the system was clearly unfair.
Were those numbers chosen to just appease the peasantry?
I can't really answer that question because I don't know. I mean, I think the delegate system was something like that. You could probably take the exact number of peasants and determine 16 million and figure out, 578 delegates over 16 million. I'm sure the number of delegates were chosen just so they would be under. They had to be under, because the people proposing the system were members of the clergy or nobility or both. The peasants are not. It's just some way of throwing a bone to the peasants, right? Okay, the old system, we admit, was corrupt. So we'll have a new system where you voting through delegates, and you're going to have 578. Well, and the clergy only 303, and the nobility only 282. So you're going to have more delegates than either the clergy or nobility, without telling them that if you add the clergy and nobility together, the numbers exceed those of the peasantry. So
Mhm.
the answer to your question is certainly dreamed up, a system dreamed up by members of the clergy and
Yeah.
nobility to throw a bone to the peasants. Now, I want to say on June 3, there's something called a Charter of Rights that is drawn up. And I want to read a few things here. There were 10 principles in these Charter of Rights, just like Jefferson was insistent that there be, come on, Jeff, get down, that there be a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. Jefferson always argued for that. And Madison said, well, why do we need a Bill of Rights? Because everybody knows what rights citizens ought to have. And Jefferson says people might know it, but we need to write it down. So there's something to which we can appeal. One of which was this: rights for all the citizens. Another stated that the States General alone shall levy money on the nation and shall appropriate it. Not going to be the king doing this. Number 2, laws should be made by the States General only with the consent of the king. So it's going to be the States General, this in this Charter of Rights, that decides the issues. The king will give his consent or his veto. So I talk about rights for the citizens. The fourth one's really interesting. Printers shall be liable to legal prosecution for printing and publishing false facts, injurious to the party prosecuting, but they shall be under no other restraints. So we have freedom of the press, but one condition: if you print falsities, you are liable to prosecution for those faulty. Now, if we had something like that going on today,
Oh my goodness.
it would be astonishing.
But I know from your earlier works and writings and videos, you talked about Jefferson and his ideas about freedom of the press. And he would say, go ahead, you can print falsehoods and whatnot. That's what freedom of the press really is. So to me, seeing this in the French Bill of Rights implies to me that he wasn't very influential in that regard.
Jefferson wasn't?
Jefferson wasn't.
I don't think, come on. I don't think Jefferson, I think Jefferson was in many respects behind much of what's going on here at this dinner, and he's one of the large figures behind the dinner and the French Revolution, mainly because he is the author of the Declaration of Independence. He's recognized to be one of the great figures as great founding father figures. And the Declaration gives him certain celebrity and status that other prominent founders didn't have. So to go back, so Jefferson is not supposed to be giving this dinner, right? But he does. Right. And he's sort of contravening, he's violating his duties as minister plenipotentiary. He's not supposed to be involved in political affairs of another nation, and in some sense he is. What is he really doing? Does Jefferson involve himself in the conversation? Nowhere does he say that. I don't think he does. And I compare this in the paper that you read in my book, An American in Paris, Thomas Jefferson. I'll put the book up at the end of the video if anybody wants to get an autographed copy. But Jefferson, during his tenure in Paris, there's a time when Jefferson is a boy and one leader of an Indian nation, Utases, comes and he speaks. He's about, I think, to go to Washington or somewhere. And I don't know where he's going to go, but he's going to leave his tribe. He went to Washington later. This is when Jefferson was young. He's giving this talk to his tribal members. It's night, and Jefferson is a boy. He doesn't understand a word the Indian leader chief is saying, but talks about him having the eloquence of Demosthenes or Cicero without understanding a thing he said, because he senses the augustness of the leader and the reverence that the tribal members have for him. I think what's going on here, at least I argue in my book, is that it's something similar. Why? Jefferson knew French. He could write in French. He could speak in French, but his French wasn't great. Why do I say that? I'm surmising here. My French isn't great. I've had 6 years of French. I can speak French and write French and read French and understand it. But I don't know if you studied Russian, but when you are so proficient in French, and then you try to understand people speaking it, they speak it very fast. It's a
Yes, it's hard
very
to tell where one
fluid,
word ends and another one begins.
and it's fluid. There's actually
Yeah,
elision, as it were, from one word to the next, where the words almost blend together and speak it very fast. That's just the way French people speak, and it's very hard to follow. I think what's going on is Jefferson is following in just things about which they're talking, but he doesn't understand sentence to sentence. He's not following. He's like, okay, I see they're talking about the clergy right now. He's picking up on certain terms and sentences without understanding exactly what's going on. So when he talks about there being great eloquence going on at the whole time, it's not that he understands everything about which they're talking. I don't
right.
think he does.
He's reading their
Just
body language, the tone in their voice, and
and picking up on certain sentences that he understands in words without
right.
understanding exactly everything that's said. So is he participating? No. He's there as a figure. He's there as a representative from this great new nation, the United States, that he's there as one of the great founding fathers, as a figure that incited the American Revolution. And if France wants a revolution and a constitution that is similar, that represents the interests of the people, we've got one of the great American figures here. And just having the dinner at Jefferson's house, but he's got to come up again, having it at Jefferson's house is symbolic. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's going to be, Lafayette said, my house is always crowded. It's not that his house is always crowded. If we have it at Jefferson, there's going to be a certain reverence that everybody has.
And that would, I think that would have the effect of influencing the royalists to maybe lean towards the Republican ideologies and go along with some sort of change in the revolution.
It could, but it also could have the effect of having, like Jefferson was very conciliatory. It could have the effect of all parties really pushing towards conciliation, pushing towards not having, unlike Putin and Zelensky. Putin, agrees to come to the bargaining table, but he won't change any of his. He's not going to compromise on anything.
Right.
No NATO membership for Ukraine, and whatever countries, whatever provinces that we have, that we currently occupy, we get to keep everything we stole. The 4 provinces as well as Crimea. Right. Jefferson, I think, would not necessarily be pushing he probably would be pushing the aristocrats towards thinking more democratically, but he's also pushing the representatives of the people, of popular government, to conciliate for the time being with the aristocrats. Because the thing is not to get a perfect constitution or the perfect compromise, but to get the ball rolling.
All right.
You can always tweak the system.
Sure. Now, one of the things, again, you mentioned that I just want to get back to this, the legal prosecution for printing and publishing false facts. I was wondering, since France was one of the, I guess, highlighted Enlightenment countries. Jefferson noted that this was France resembled or exemplified the Enlightenment more than any other country. And the Enlightenment's whole part of their philosophy is to let's get at the truth. Could that have been one of the reasons why the publishing false things in newspapers could have made its way into their constitution?
The clergy and aristocrats do not want to make any concessions to the hoi polloi, the people, because the people always been thought from Greek times to be ignorant and foolish.
Okay.
But you have to have a revolution like Jefferson was proposing with his republicanism, is that no, the people really aren't so stupid. They have moral sense, faculty.
Okay.
They're just as moral as everybody else. And with the modicum of education, they can, if they may not be able to, we got a little over 3 minutes left. They may not be able to make enlightened political decisions by themselves, but they're at least qualified with a small amount of to select representatives who can think for them.
Okay.
But they do have to involve themselves abundantly in politics to make sure that their representatives are not deceiving them or cheating them. and they can do
Okay.
that if they want to get involved.
But the nobility and the aristocrats just weren't quite on Jefferson's court in terms of thinking about the hoi polloi.
Well, Jefferson is clearly backing the people. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Um, was there anything else that you wanted to say about the causes and the after?
No, I mean, I list three. The only thing I'll add is that when we talk about the cause, people say, what was the cause of the Civil War? Was it slavery? It's a stupid question because
Sure.
these things are causes of any event like that are causes are so numerous and so difficult to disentangle. All we can do is try to pull out or tweak out the most prominent, most obvious causes
Right.
and speculate on just how they came into play. So it's highly speculative.
Okay, now the time remaining, would you like to comment on how invested in the French Revolution Jefferson was?
Yeah, I talk about that in my book on Jefferson's time American in Paris, uh, whatever the title is, I forget. But and I talk about that on Jefferson in history and in liberty. Um, he was heavily invested. He believed in government of and by the people, and he believed the people were smart enough, at least sufficiently smart, not abundantly smart, but smart enough to be able to elect all officials. They were morally responsible enough, perhaps even more than their representatives, because they were uncorrupted by the reasons of and by temptations of money to oversee matters and things like that. And he wanted to see in the United States that the United States would become an empire for liberty, perhaps going all the way down to Cuba and maybe even all the way through Canada. The whole sphere of North America being, uh, comprising states of the American Republic. At least he thought in one letter that that might happen. And he wanted to see the whole world become republicanized, that there be nations that are broken down into states, whatever, into counties and into wards. And, you keep dividing and dividing. And at some point, you have government of and by the people. So I'll not read all the stuff. So he was mightily invested. Um, I'll just end with this quote in the last minute here. He writes to
Sure.
William Short in 1793. This is the year that the king is killed. His wife is off with their heads. He says, in the struggle which was necessary, many guilty persons fell without the forms of trial, with some of them innocent. Um, I'll go on to read. He says, the liberty of the whole earth was depending on the issue of the contest, and was ever such a prize won with so little innocent blood. My own affections had been deeply wounded by some of the martyrs of this cause, but rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated. Were there but one, an Adam and an Eve left in every country left free, it would be better than as it is.